Thanks for listening to the Thoughts on the Adventist Message podcast. My hope is that all who hear this podcast will reconsider their understanding of what it means to preach the three angels' messages to the world. I'm certain I haven't figured it all out, but I hope that these episodes spark conversations that can bring us to realize God's full desire for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So we see that the issue of worship is a fundamental principle of the context of these messages, but there's a very significant distinction that needs to be made. Even though the same word, both in English as well as in Greek, is used in chapter 13, referring to the worship of the dragon and his allies, the same word is used in chapter 14 in reference to the God of heaven. The worship of the dragon and his allies is fundamentally different from the worship of the God of heaven. This is revealed throughout the entirety of Scripture. And in this episode, we'll look specifically from this passage as well as other portions of Scripture as to what the worship of the dragon, the worship of Satan, the worship that he seeks and accepts, what that entails. First, what is worship? Just a standard dictionary definition of worship. This is from an Oxford dictionary. Worship as a verb is to treat someone or something with the reverence and adoration appropriate to a deity. To treat someone or something with the reverence and adoration appropriate to a deity. Worship here is just an external thing. It's an action. It's something done, something you can see, but it's something done, anything to express that a person or a thing is worthy of the reverence and adoration that is due to a deity. But I want to emphasize again that it's an action. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that this action corresponds to an internal reality. One may do something that is worship to express this reverence or adoration appropriate to a deity, to someone or something, even though they themselves don't believe that that individual is a deity or is worthy of worship. For example, this will bring us to our first example of the kind of worship that Satan accepts. In Daniel chapter 3, we find Nebuchadnezzar setting up an image and commanding that all should bow down and worship him. This is under threat of death. It is not the case that all of those who bowed down, even outside of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it's not the case that all of them were convicted of the deity of this image. They were doing this act of worship because they were threatened with death. And so we see here, even though they likely did not have, it's really no way for them to have been convicted in their hearts that this image is divine, they were engaging in acts of worship, external acts that were disconnected from an internal reality. And so we see here, as I mentioned, one example of the kind of worship that Satan accepts. This kind of worship is worship based on coercion. Worship based on force, worship based on fear, on threat. If you don't do this act of worship, this X, Y, or Z will happen to you. And so we find here one of the kinds of worship that Satan accepts is worship that's based on coercion or force. But just in the chapter preceding this, in the end of Daniel chapter 2, when Daniel is able to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Nebuchadnezzar, it says, falls down before Daniel and effectively worships, commands that incense should be brought before him. This is in Daniel chapter 2, verse 46. And then in verse 47, he says, "Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret." What happened here? Nebuchadnezzar experienced the divinity of Daniel's God. Nebuchadnezzar saw that Daniel's God is great and is powerful, and so he does an external act. He falls prostrate before Daniel, commands that incense should be offered to Daniel, and he does these acts of worship, but these acts of worship follow an internal reality, an internal conviction that Daniel's God is God and is worthy of this worship. But again, this is to show a distinction between the kind of worship that Satan accepts, which is illustrated in chapter 3, a worship that is based on force, on coercion. We see this also in the passage in Revelation chapter 13. There's a death decree given in the end of the passage. It says that no one could buy or sell, but also it says before that, this is in Revelation chapter 13 and looking in verse 15, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So people are worshiping, but again, they're not worshiping because they're convicted of the deity of this image of the beast. They're worshiping because if they don't do it, they will be killed. So they're worshiping based on force. They are being coerced. So that's the first one. The second kind of worship that we find that Satan accepts is worship based on compensation. Compensation, payment, this for that. If you worship me, I will give you this. I will reward you. This is most prominently featured in Satan's temptation of Christ, shown in Matthew chapter 4 and also in Luke chapter 4, where he says to Jesus, if you bow down and worship me, I will give you all these kingdoms of the earth. Again, Satan does not expect that Jesus is going to see his greatness and see his divinity. And because of that internal conviction, he's going to externally express that by bowing down and worshiping him. Satan is happy to accept Jesus just going through the motion of worship, just externally honoring him with his lips, even though his heart is far from him, and just do an act of worship for exchange, for a reward, in as a compensation. So we see first that Satan accepts worship based on coercion, by force, by fear, threatening. Secondly, we see that Satan accepts worship based on compensation. Finally, we see in the passage in Revelation 13 that Satan accepts worship based on deception, based on deception. This is seen in verse 14. He, talking about the beast that comes out of the earth, he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. And then as a result of that, after making that image of the beast, then everyone is forced to worship that. But notice, people are deceived into thinking that they should do this, which becomes eventually a form of worship of the sea beast. And so here we see here that the worship is not based on who the beast actually is, not based on the fact that the beast has shown himself to be worthy of worship, but because the people are deceived, they are the character of this beast is disguised, and people, because of this, what they see, what they believe to be the character of this beast, they are convinced that they ought to worship this. And so here we see another kind of worship that Satan and his allies accept, a worship that is based on deception. So these three issues are at play here. When we see Satan seeking and receiving worship, Satan accepts worship based on coercion. Satan accepts worship based on compensation. And finally, he accepts worship that is based on deception. And so we see in the passage here that there's a distinction, which we'll look at in the next episode, between the kind of worship that Satan seeks and accepts and the kind of worship that God seeks and accepts.